The fires outside the walls stretched so far into the darkness that some people in Constantinople believe the stars themselves have fallen to earth. From the towers overlooking the land walls, exhausted defenders stared out at tens of thousands of Ottoman campfires flickering across the hills like a second horizon, an ocean of light surrounding the last great city of the Roman Empire. Somewhere beyond those flames stood massive cannons unlike anything medieval Europe had ever seen, machines so enormous that people claimed the ground shook miles away every time they fired. And inside the city, behind walls that had protected Constantinople for nearly 1,000 years, something far more dangerous than the Ottoman army had already begun to spread. Fear. Because this was not just another siege. This was the moment an entire civilization realized it had been abandoned. Most people today imagine the fall of Constantinople as a simple historical event, a famous battle where one empire defeated another. But medieval history rarely tells you what it actually felt like to live through those final weeks inside the city itself. The hunger, the exhaustion, the endless prayers echoing through dark churches while families whispered rumors that the end of the world had finally arrived. By the spring of 1453, Constantinople was no longer the shining capital people remembered from ancient stories. The population had collapsed. Entire neighborhoods sat nearly empty behind the massive walls. Crumbling buildings stood beside abandoned forums where merchants once traded goods from 3 continents. The empire that had once ruled the eastern Mediterranean had shrunk to little more than the city itself. Yet despite everything, the people inside still believed the walls could save them. After all, they always had. For centuries, wave after wave of invaders had failed to break Constantinople. Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Crusaders. The walls had outlasted them all. They were more than stone. They were a symbol that Rome itself could never truly die. But this time was different. This time, the enemy outside the gates was led by a 21-year-old sultan named Mehmed, a ruler obsessed with one goal above all others. He did not simply want to conquer Constantinople. He wanted to erase the last memory of the Roman Empire forever. And unlike the armies that came before him, Mehmed arrived with something medieval warfare had never fully faced before: gunpowder on a terrifying scale. Every day, the giant bombards thundered against the ancient walls, and every night the defenders rushed into the darkness, carrying stones, timber, and dirt to repair the damage before sunrise. People barely slept. Priests marched through the streets carrying icons while crowds gathered in candlelit churches begging for miracles that never came. Some still believed reinforcements from Western Europe would arrive. Others already understood the truth. No army was coming. No fleet was appearing over the horizon. Constantinople was alone. And if you stay with me through this story, you'll see why the fall of Constantinople was far more horrifying than most history books ever dared to describe. Long before the Ottoman banners appeared outside the walls, the city had already begun to decay from within. Travelers entering Constantinople during the final years of the Byzantine Empire often expected to see the legendary capital described in old chronicles, the wealthiest city in Christendom, a place of golden domes, crowded markets, and endless imperial ceremonies. Instead, many found silence. Entire districts had become strangely empty. Ancient palaces stood partially abandoned. Weeds pushed through cracked stone roads where triumphal parades once passed beneath marble statues of emperors who had ruled half the known world. Even the population told the story of collapse. At its height, Constantinople had held hundreds of thousands of people. By 1453, some estimates suggest fewer than 50,000 remained inside the massive walls built for a city many times larger. Vast sections of land between the inner neighborhoods had turned into gardens and farmland because there were no longer enough people to fill the streets. Chickens wandered through ruined courtyards. Small farms appeared beside churches that had once served crowded communities. To outsiders, the city looked less like the heart of an empire and more like the fading ghost of one. Yet the memory of greatness still haunted every corner. Hagia Sophia still rose above the skyline like a monument to another age, its enormous dome catching sunlight even as the empire around it crumbled. Old men still spoke about Justinian and Constantine as if the glory of Rome had only recently faded. Priests insisted the city remain protected by divine favor. Some even believed ancient prophecies guaranteed Constantinople could never truly fall to foreign conquerors. That belief became one of the last things holding the population together. Because politically, economically, and militarily, the empire was already exhausted. The Byzantine emperors had spent generations fighting civil wars, foreign invasions, and internal betrayals. Crusaders from Western Europe had once occupied and looted the city themselves during the Fourth Crusade, an event many Byzantines never emotionally recovered from. Trade slipped increasingly into the hands of powerful Italian merchant republics like Venice and Genoa. Byzantine territory continued shrinking decade after decade until almost nothing remained beyond the city walls. And perhaps worst of all, the Christian world itself was divided. Desperate for military aid from Western Europe, Emperor Constantine XI attempted to reunite the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, despite fierce resistance from many citizens inside Constantinople. To some Byzantines, accepting Catholic authority felt like surrendering their identity. Tensions spread through the churches and marketplaces. Arguments broke out between those who believed unity with the West was necessary for survival and those who believed it would betray centuries of Orthodox tradition. One famous phrase echoed throughout the city during those final months: "Better the turban of the Turk than the hat of the Latin." That was how deep the bitterness had become. While Ottoman cannons prepared outside the walls, the defenders inside could not even fully agree on who their allies should be. And still, despite all of it, the city refused to give up hope completely. Every morning, church bells rang across Constantinople as priests led prayers for salvation. Soldiers repaired defenses with dwindling supplies. Merchants continued selling bread and oil in crowded squares. Fishermen still launched small boats into the Bosporus beneath the shadow of the walls. Life continued because people wanted to believe the city had survived too much to die now. But beyond the horizon, Mehmed was building something that would shatter not only the walls of Constantinople, but the medieval world's entire understanding of warfare itself. Mehmed II was only 21 years old when he stood before the walls of Constantinople. Yet by that point, he already carried the ambition of a man determined to reshape history itself. To many in Europe, he seemed too young to accomplish what countless armies had failed to do for centuries. Some Western observers dismissed him as inexperienced, believing the ancient walls of the city would humble him just as they had humbled so many rulers before. But inside the Ottoman camp, people quickly realized this siege was unlike anything they had ever seen. Mehmet was not preparing for a seasonal raid or a temporary blockade. He was preparing for the destruction of an empire. From childhood, he had been fascinated by Constantinople. He studied the city's history, its defenses, and the legends surrounding it. He reportedly spoke multiple languages and surrounded himself with scholars, engineers, and military advisors. But more than anything else, he understood symbolism. As long as Constantinople remained unconquered, the Ottoman Empire could never fully claim dominance over the Eastern Mediterranean. The city stood directly between Ottoman territories in Europe and Asia, like a surviving monument to another age. Taking it would not simply make Mehmed powerful, it would make him immortal. Long before the siege began, he started preparing carefully and methodically. One of his first moves was the construction of a massive fortress along the Bosphorus Strait called Rumeli Hisari. Built astonishingly fast on the European side of the waterway, the fortress allowed the Ottomans to control naval traffic between the Black Sea and Constantinople. Ships attempting to pass without permission faced Ottoman cannons positioned high above the narrow channel. The message was clear. Constantinople was being isolated from the outside world piece by piece. But the most terrifying part of Mehmed's preparations came from his obsession with artillery. Medieval walls had survived for centuries because traditional siege weapons simply could not break them efficiently. The Theodosian walls protecting Constantinople were among the strongest fortifications ever constructed. Layered defenses stretching for miles with towers, inner barriers, and deep moats. Many believed they were invincible. Mehmed intended to prove otherwise. A Hungarian engineer named Orban arrived at the Ottoman court offering something extraordinary. Giant bombards capable of firing massive stone projectiles, powerful enough to crack ancient fortifications. According to accounts from the time, one of the largest cannons measured more than 20 feet long and required enormous teams of workers and oxen just to move it across the countryside. The journey itself became legendary. Roads had to be reinforced, bridges strengthened. Entire crews labored for weeks, dragging the giant machine toward Constantinople, while curious villagers gathered to stare at the impossible weapon rolling past their homes. And when the cannons finally arrived outside the city walls, many defenders could scarcely believe what they were seeing. These were not ordinary siege engines. They looked almost unnatural for the medieval world, massive bronze monsters positioned against fortifications that had once seemed eternal. Then came the sound. Witnesses described explosions so loud they echoed for miles across the land and sea. Windows rattled deep inside the city, church walls trembled. Smoke drifted over the countryside after each blast, while huge sections of stone defenses shook beneath impacts unlike anything the Byzantine defenders had experienced before. Some citizens believed the noise itself felt apocalyptic, as though the earth were splitting open beneath Constantinople. And perhaps the most frightening realization was this: the Ottomans were not relying on luck or sheer numbers alone. They had arrived with a new form of warfare the medieval world was not fully prepared to face. Behind the walls, people still prayed for miracles. Outside the walls, Mehmed was preparing to destroy the old world with fire, engineering, and relentless patience. The first time the giant cannons opened fire in full force, many people inside the city thought an earthquake had struck Constantinople. The sound rolled across the walls like thunder trapped inside stone, deep enough to shake homes far from the front lines. Dust drifted down from ceilings inside churches. Windows rattled. Animals panicked in the streets. Some citizens reportedly crossed themselves and fell to their knees, convinced the final judgment of God had arrived. For centuries, the Theodosian walls had survived siege after siege, but now every blast sent tremors through defenses once believed untouchable. What terrified the defenders most was not only the destruction itself, but the realization that the walls could no longer guarantee safety. Every morning, the Ottoman artillery crews positioned their bombards carefully across the fields outside the city. Teams of workers loaded enormous stone balls into bronze barrels blackened by smoke and heat. Then came the waiting. Defenders standing atop the walls often describe moments of terrible silence just before each discharge, when entire sections of the battlefield seemed to freeze. Then the explosion would erupt across the landscape, followed seconds later by the horrifying impact against the ancient fortifications. Great clouds of dust and shattered stone burst into the air while alarm bells echoed through the city. Yet Constantinople did not collapse immediately. Every night, while much of the population tried desperately to sleep, repair crews hurried to damaged sections of the walls, carrying timber, rope, stones, and barrels of dirt. Monks, merchants, laborers, soldiers, and even elderly citizens joined together under torchlight, attempting to rebuild defenses before dawn revealed the damage to the Ottoman army. The atmosphere inside the city became one of constant exhaustion. Few people rested properly anymore. Fires burned through the night near the damaged fortifications, while priests walked among workers, offering prayers and blessings to men whose hands bled from lifting rubble hour after hour. Emperor Constantine XI himself frequently appeared near the walls, encouraging defenders and inspecting repairs, refusing to hide behind palace gates while the city struggled to survive. But despite these efforts, fear continued spreading faster than the damage itself. Rumors moved through Constantinople constantly. Some claimed Ottoman spies had already infiltrated the city. Others whispered that Western Europe had abandoned them completely. Sailors arriving at the harbor brought conflicting stories about possible Venetian or Genoese reinforcements. Every sighting on the horizon sparked desperate hope, only for disappointment to settle over the population again when no rescue fleet appeared. Inside churches, arguments broke out over prophecy and divine punishment. Some priests insisted the city suffered because of sin and disunity among Christians. Others urged people not to lose faith, even as the walls trembled daily beneath Ottoman bombardment. Strange omens only deepened the panic. One night, an eerie fog reportedly settled around parts of the city, while flickering lights appeared near the dome of Hagia Sophia. Citizens interpreted the event in wildly different ways. Some believed angels still protected Constantinople. Others feared God had finally abandoned the city altogether. Meanwhile, outside the walls, Mehmet remained patient. He understood something many earlier invaders had failed to grasp. Constantinople did not need to be destroyed in a single dramatic assault. It only needed to be worn down, physically, emotionally, and psychologically until hope itself collapsed. Day after day, the cannons continued firing. Day after day, the defenders repaired what they could. But slowly, the balance began shifting. The ancient walls still stood, yet the people behind them were beginning to realize they were fighting against more than an army. They were fighting against time, exhaustion, fear, and the terrifying possibility that the medieval world they had known for centuries was already coming to an end. As the siege dragged deeper into the spring of 1453, fear inside the city slowly transformed into something even more dangerous: exhaustion. At first, many citizens still believed the walls would hold long enough for help to arrive. But after weeks of relentless bombardment, sleepless nights, and constant tension, hope itself began to wear thin. The streets of Constantinople grew quieter with each passing day. Markets still operated, but supplies became increasingly limited. Bread lines stretched longer through the city squares, while merchants guarded dwindling stores of grain, oil, and wine. Fishermen risked Ottoman patrols to bring food through the harbor, yet it was never enough for a population trapped behind walls with no certainty about tomorrow. People learned to ration everything. Candles burned shorter. Fires were kept smaller at night. Families whispered instead of speaking loudly, because anxiety seemed to hang over every home like smoke. But perhaps the greatest damage was happening inside people's minds. Every hour brought fresh rumors. Some said Genoese reinforcements had been spotted crossing the sea. Others claimed the Pope had secretly abandoned the city. Stories spread that hidden traitors planned to open the gates to the Ottomans during the night. No one knew what was true anymore. Fear itself became contagious. Inside the churches, crowds gathered beneath flickering candlelight while priests led desperate prayers for deliverance. The sound of chanting echoed through Hagia Sophia day and night as exhausted citizens begged for miracles. Yet even religion no longer united the city completely. Tensions between Orthodox Christians and supporters of reunion with the Catholic West continued simmering beneath the surface. Some citizens believed God was punishing Constantinople for accepting Western influence. Others insisted refusing unity had doomed them instead. Arguments erupted in marketplaces and narrow alleyways, while Ottoman cannons thundered in the distance. It was as if the city were being pulled apart spiritually, at the exact moment it needed unity most. Strange stories spread rapidly during those final weeks. People spoke about mysterious lights in the sky, shadows moving along the walls at night, and ancient prophecies predicting the empire's destruction. One rumor claimed an angel would descend at the last moment to save Constantinople from the invaders. Another claimed the city's fall had already been written centuries earlier and could no longer be stopped. In times of fear, people searched desperately for signs that history still made sense. Meanwhile, the defenders along the walls were approaching physical collapse. Many soldiers had barely slept properly in days. Every bombardment forced them into emergency repairs, while Ottoman troops constantly tested weak points around the defenses. Rain turned sections of ground near the walls into mud. Smoke from artillery fires drifted across the skyline. The smell of damp stone, sweat, seawater, and burning powder lingered across the city constantly. Yet Emperor Constantine XI refused to surrender. Despite impossible odds, he continued walking among the defenders, encouraging exhausted troops and organizing repairs wherever the walls suffered damage. To many citizens, his determination became one of the last remaining sources of stability. If the emperor still believed Constantinople could survive, perhaps they could believe it too. But outside the walls, Mehmed understood exactly what was happening. He no longer needed to frighten the city with a single overwhelming attack. The siege itself was becoming the weapon. Every day of isolation weakened morale. Every sleepless night deepened despair. Every unanswered prayer reminded the people inside that Constantinople stood alone against an empire growing more confident by the hour. And slowly, beneath the sound of church bells and cannon fire, the ancient city began losing faith not only in rescue, but in its own future. By the final weeks of the siege, the walls no longer felt like the edge of a city. They felt like the front line of another world. Sleep had become almost impossible for the defenders. Ottoman cannons continued firing during the day, while nights brought fresh alarms, sudden assaults, and frantic repair work beneath torchlight. Men staggered through the streets with hollow eyes and soot-covered faces, barely able to tell one day from the next. The city existed in a permanent state of tension, where every distant sound could mean another attack was beginning. Along the land walls, the atmosphere turned increasingly chaotic. Ottoman engineers dug trenches and tunnels toward the defenses, while waves of soldiers tested weak sections under cover of darkness. Horns echoed across the battlefield at unpredictable hours, forcing exhausted defenders to rush back into position again and again. Rain mixed with smoke and dirt until sections of the battlefield became thick fields of mud. Fires burned across damaged towers, while church bells rang through the night, warning citizens to stay alert. Yet, despite the pressure, the defenders still refused to surrender the walls. Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani became one of the most important figures in the city's defense, organizing disciplined resistance around the most vulnerable sections of the fortifications. His men fought beside Byzantine soldiers, Venetian sailors, monks, laborers, and ordinary citizens who had never expected to become part of a final stand for an empire already fading into history. Some defenders carried swords and shields worn from years of service. Others arrived with hunting bows, axes, or simple tools taken from workshops and farms inside the city. What united them was the understanding that there was nowhere left to retreat. Constantinople had become a fortress surrounded by an empire determined to erase it. Inside the city, daily life continued collapsing under the pressure. Entire neighborhoods remained awake at night, listening to the distant sounds of digging, shouting, and artillery. Families crowded into churches, seeking safety beneath stone domes, while rumors spread that Ottoman troops had already infiltrated parts of the walls. The fear was no longer abstract. People could hear the siege creeping closer hour by hour. In some areas, damaged fortifications revealed open cracks where defenders worked desperately to reinforce breaches with wooden barricades, barrels, rubble, and anything else they could find. Every repaired section felt temporary. Every sunrise brought the possibility that the walls might finally fail. Yet the city still resisted with astonishing determination. Byzantine ships inside the Golden Horn continued helping defend the harbor, while chains stretched across the water to block Ottoman naval access. Then came one of the most shocking moments of the entire siege. Mehmed ordered Ottoman ships dragged over land itself. Greased logs were laid across hills north of the harbor, and under cover of darkness, crews hauled vessels across the countryside and lowered them into the Golden Horn behind the city's naval defenses. When the defenders awoke and saw Ottoman sails inside waters they believed protected, disbelief spread across Constantinople. It felt impossible, as though the siege itself had begun bending reality. Panic surged through the population because the city was no longer threatened from only one direction. The sense of encirclement became complete. By now, the psychological strain inside Constantinople had become overwhelming. People moved through narrow streets beneath smoke-filled skies, while the sound of distant cannon fire echoed constantly in the background. Children cried during the night whenever bombardments resumed. Priests led endless prayers, while exhausted soldiers leaned against shattered walls, trying to stay awake long enough for dawn. Still, the banners of Byzantium remained above the defenses. Still, the emperor refused surrender. But beneath the determination and ritual, another truth was beginning to settle over the city. Constantinople was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting to delay the inevitable for one more day. On the evening of May 28, 1453, an unnatural silence settled over parts of the battlefield outside the city. After weeks of endless cannon fire, sudden assaults, and constant movement across the Ottoman camps, the quiet itself felt terrifying. From the walls, Byzantine defenders watched thousands of torches flicker across the darkness, while distant voices echoed through the night air. They understood what the silence meant. The final assault was coming. Inside Constantinople, churches filled with exhausted citizens praying through the night beneath clouds of incense and candle smoke. For the first time in centuries, Orthodox and Catholic clergy gathered together inside Hagia Sophia, despite years of bitterness and division. Nobles, soldiers, merchants, refugees, and laborers stood side by side beneath the Great Dome, listening to chants that echoed through the ancient cathedral. Many people wept openly. Others remained silent, staring at the marble floors, as if they already knew the city's fate had been sealed. Emperor Constantine XI moved through the crowds, offering final words of encouragement before returning to the walls. Witnesses later described him as calm, but deeply aware that Constantinople stood at the edge of destruction. According to accounts from the time, he asked forgiveness from those around him and prepared himself not as an emperor expecting victory, but as a man ready to disappear alongside his city. Beyond the walls, Mehmed completed his preparations carefully. Ottoman artillery crews positioned the great bombards for maximum effect, while soldiers gathered in massive formations across the fields. Drums echoed through the night. Religious leaders moved among the Ottoman troops, promising glory and reward for the coming attack. Fires stretched endlessly across the horizon, surrounding Constantinople in a ring of light that seemed almost unreal beneath the dark sky. Some defenders later claimed the sight felt less like an army preparing for battle, and more like the approach of an unstoppable force of nature. Then before dawn on May 29th, the attack began. Cannons erupted once again across the battlefield, while horns and drums shattered the early morning darkness. Ottoman forces surged toward weakened sections of the walls, wave after wave, while exhausted defenders rushed to hold the breaches that had been damaged by weeks of bombardment. Smoke rolled across the fortifications. Torches flickered through dust and chaos. Orders, prayers, and warning cries blended together into a constant roar echoing through the city. For hours, the defenders somehow continued resisting despite overwhelming pressure. Emperor Constantine himself reportedly fought near the most dangerous sections of the walls alongside Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani and other defenders trying desperately to prevent Ottoman troops from establishing a permanent breakthrough. But the city's exhaustion had reached its limit. Giustiniani was severely wounded during the fighting and carried away from the walls, a moment that shattered morale among many defenders who viewed him as one of the strongest leaders in the city's defense. Confusion spread rapidly after his departure. Sections of the fortifications became disorganized as Ottoman forces pressed harder against weakened positions. Then came the moment many Byzantines had feared for weeks. Ottoman banners appeared above parts of the walls. Somewhere amid the confusion, panic began spreading through defenders and civilians alike as news raced through Constantinople that the outer defenses had finally failed. The city that had resisted for centuries was being breached. And in the middle of the chaos, Emperor Constantine XI made his final decision. Refusing escape, he reportedly removed the symbols of his imperial rank and entered the fighting as an ordinary soldier among his men. No one knows exactly where he died. No confirmed grave was ever found. The last Roman emperor simply vanished into the collapse of the city he had refused to abandon. As news spread that the walls had been breached, panic rolled through the city faster than any army could move. Bells rang wildly across Constantinople, while terrified crowds flooded into narrow streets already choked with smoke, rubble, and confusion. Some people rushed toward the harbor, hoping ships might still offer escape. Others barricaded themselves inside homes with whatever they could find. But thousands moved toward one place above all others: Hagia Sophia. For centuries, the massive cathedral had stood at the spiritual heart of the Byzantine world, its enormous dome towering above the skyline like a symbol that Constantinople would endure forever. Now frightened citizens poured through its bronze doors carrying icons, candles, children, and whatever possessions they could still hold in trembling hands. Priests led prayers beneath flickering golden mosaics while exhausted refugees packed the cathedral shoulder to shoulder, listening to the distant sounds of chaos spreading through the city outside. Some believed a miracle would still happen there. Ancient prophecies claimed heavenly forces would save Constantinople at the final moment and drive the invaders back. In times of terror, many clung desperately to those stories because there was little else left to hold on to. But outside Hagia Sophia, the old world was collapsing street by street. Ottoman forces moved deeper into the city, while defenders struggled to organize resistance amid confusion and exhaustion. Smoke drifted across ancient forums and marketplaces where Byzantine banners had flown for centuries. Crowds surged through alleyways, searching for loved ones or trying to avoid the growing disorder spreading through Constantinople. The sounds of church bells mixed with shouted commands, prayers, weeping, and the distant thunder of cannon fire still echoing from the damaged walls. What made the situation even more horrifying was how quickly the illusion of safety disappeared. For generations, many Byzantines had believed the city's massive walls and divine protection made Constantinople fundamentally different from other places. It was not supposed to fall. The idea seemed almost unimaginable, even during the darkest moments of the siege. Yet now, people watched foreign banners rising above towers and gates they had trusted all their lives. The psychological shock was immense. It felt less like defeat and more like reality itself had broken apart. Hagia Sophia became the emotional center of that collapse. Inside the cathedral, terrified citizens prayed beneath dim light pouring through high windows while clergy continued religious services, despite the sounds growing louder outside. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as surreal. Thousands of people trapped between faith and despair inside one of the greatest churches in Christendom, while an empire vanished around them. Some expected divine intervention until the very last moment. Others sat silently, already understanding the city they knew no longer existed. Then, eventually, even the cathedral's enormous doors could no longer separate the frightened crowds inside from the reality overtaking Constantinople. The final barrier between the old Byzantine world and the new Ottoman one had collapsed. Yet, amid all the fear and confusion, Mehmed himself reportedly entered the city with remarkable control compared to what many defenders had feared during the siege. He understood the symbolic weight of what had happened. This was not simply the capture of another fortress, it was the conquest of Constantinople, the city emperors had ruled from for over 1,000 years. According to later accounts, when Mehmed finally entered Hagia Sophia, he paused beneath the massive dome and looked upward in silence. Around him stood exhausted survivors surrounded by smoke, dust, shattered certainty, and the remains of a civilization that had once called itself eternal. In a single morning, the last remnant of the Roman Empire had disappeared from history. And for those who survived inside the city, it must have felt as though the entire medieval world had ended with it. When the sun finally rose over the city after the siege ended, Constantinople no longer looked like the capital of an empire that had survived for more than 1,000 years. Smoke drifted above shattered walls, while the streets that once carried emperors, merchants, priests, and pilgrims now felt strangely hollow beneath the morning light. The banners had changed. The bells that once echoed across the skyline fell silent one by one. And somewhere amid the confusion and exhaustion, people slowly began realizing they had not simply witnessed the fall of a city. They had witnessed the end of an entire age of history. For centuries, Constantinople had stood as the bridge between worlds. Europe and Asia, Christianity and Islam, ancient Rome and the medieval kingdoms that rose after its collapse. Even weakened and fading, the city still carried the memory of another civilization inside its walls. Its libraries preserved ancient knowledge. Its churches guarded traditions stretching back to the first centuries of Christianity. Its walls symbolized a belief that some things could survive forever if they were strong enough, holy enough, or old enough. But in the spring of 1453, that illusion shattered. The fall of the city sent shockwaves across Europe. Rulers, priests, merchants, and scholars struggled to comprehend what had happened. Refugees fled west carrying manuscripts, stories, and memories from the dying Byzantine world. Some historians later argued that these fleeing scholars helped ignite the Renaissance in Italy by bringing ancient Greek knowledge back into Western Europe. Others saw the siege as the moment medieval warfare itself changed forever. Gunpowder had broken walls once thought invincible. Cannons had succeeded where centuries of armies had failed. The old age of castles, fortifications, and isolated kingdoms was beginning to die beneath smoke and bronze artillery. Yet, what makes the fall of Constantinople feel so haunting even now is not only the military defeat itself, it is the feeling that the people inside the city understood, at least in part, that they were watching their world disappear around them. The final prayers inside Hagia Sophia, the exhausted workers rebuilding shattered walls at night, knowing they might not hold another day. The emperor removing his royal insignia before vanishing into the chaos beside ordinary soldiers. These moments linger because they feel deeply human. They are not just stories about empires and battles. They are stories about people confronting the terrifying realization that history can end suddenly, even for civilizations that once believed themselves eternal. And perhaps that is why the siege continues to haunt so many people centuries later. Because Constantinople was never supposed to fall. Its walls had survived too long. Its history stretched too deep into the past. Its people believed too strongly that somehow the city would endure as it always had before. But history does not care about memory, tradition, or ancient glory. Sometimes, civilizations disappear slowly over centuries. Other times, they collapse in a single morning while church bells echo through smoke-filled streets. And maybe the most unsettling part of all is this. No one truly knows where Constantine XI died. No confirmed tomb was ever found. The last Roman emperor simply vanished into the collapse of his city, swallowed by dust, fear, and confusion, as the medieval world faded around him. Some legends claimed he never died at all, that he was turned to stone beneath the city and waits there still, sleeping beneath Constantinople until the day the empire rises again. Of course, legends are only stories, but when night falls over Istanbul even now, and the ancient walls still stand against the darkness beside the modern city that surrounds them, it becomes strangely easy to understand why people wanted to believe that something of old Constantinople never truly disappeared.